Today, Dr. Jamison Green and I are calling from California, or from the West Coast. So we are on West Coast time, but thank you everyone for joining today. I'm gonna let everyone trickle in before we get started. But we will be taking questions throughout the call in the chat box, also at the end of the call. So feel free to prepare your questions and ask them accordingly. Looks like everyone is in for the most part. So my name is Robert Castillo. I'm a financial planner and a volunteer with PridePlanners at FPA. I have an LGBT focused practice, so I am constantly looking for research and insight on how to better serve the community. And we came up with the idea to invite Dr. Jamison Green today, who has done great work with transgender services and equality. He has spent over 30 years specializing in health, civil rights, social safety of transgender, gender nonconforming, and transsexual people. Dr. Jamison Green, henceforth referred to as James, is an award-winning author, activist, educator, independent legal scholar, diversity and policy consultant for business, educational, and governmental institutions, and is also the first American transgender person to have served as president of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, where his initiatives have increased access to medical education regarding trans and non-binary people globally. He still writes policy statements for WPATH, is the co-chair of their ethics committee, and is a member of their faculty for their global education initiative. He is the author of Becoming a Visible Man, first published in 2004, with a new edition coming out next month. You can actually pre-order it on Amazon. And he also co-authored Navigating Trans and Complex Gender Identities last year. He's been in a number of articles in a wide variety of peer-reviewed, scholarly, and commercial publications. And he's also an Afro-Brazilian percussionist and competitive skier. Thank you, James, for joining us today.
Thank you, Robert. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak to representatives of the financial planning industry.
Yes, we are in a very unique year, right? And we thought that we should bring awareness to this community with diversity and inclusion in the limelight. We're reminded that there's such little diversity in this certified financial planning industry. Less than 4% of CFP professionals are Black or Latinx. And unfortunately, there are no numbers on how many LGBTQ financial planners there are. But obviously the need is great. And that's why we're doing this today, to really focus on the need of financial planning amongst the transgender community. So James, I'd like to start off with clarifying some terminology, because my hope is that after today, there'll be many cisgender straight people who will listen to this call, especially the board at FPA, as we collaborate to highlight the LGBTQ community. So why don't you give us a brief history of the terminology, what's used today, and enlighten us, please.
Thanks. So I think we all hear about LGBT, and we know that L stands for lesbian, G gay, B bisexual, T transgender. LGB and T are not all the same thing. Many people confuse those things. They think that a trans person is just a lesbian or a gay person who is so lesbian or gay that they want to be the opposite sex, which is a real kind of obtuse way of looking at it. But there are people who do see it that way. The reason LGB and T are tied together is actually political and has to do with our civil rights. Basically, when people are discriminated against, because we tend to see sex and gender as the same kind of thing, we lump it all together. And when people start beating on a trans woman of color, they start yelling faggot. it's all a big mishmash in terms of how people understand these concepts. So let's take it back apart and look at what sex and gender are. Sex simply is a system of classification for presumed reproductive capacity based on, in the human sense, a cursory examination of genitalia at birth. There's nothing else attached to it. And how we view sex comes from plant biology. Historically, scientifically, the root of sex in humans, in human sexology, comes from plant biology. So our language reflects that, and the way we think about things reflects that too, because we tend to look at things in a very binary way. There's either males or females. And really, let me backtrack 1 second. We think of males are the people who have XY chromosomes, and females are the people who have XX chromosomes. And we look at that as say that's the truth and that's all there is. And that is not the truth, because that is not all there is. There are people with other kinds of sex chromosomal configurations. There are males who have XX chromosomes who don't find out that they have XX chromosomes until they're trying to conceive children with a partner. And then of course they figure that the partner's problem because she's not conceiving. So eventually when they rule out that she has no physiological impairment, then they start to look at the guy, and the guy has XX chromosomes. Maybe one of the reasons that there's for male infertility. So people don't understand that because we don't get that in our high school biology classes. And this is a known fact that's been in medical textbooks for decades and decades. There are people with XX chromosomes there are people with XY chromosomes who have female bodies. And people don't find out that they have XY chromosomes until as they hit puberty, they don't start menstruating. So they begin to look at why is this happening, and find out that they have a congenital androgen insensitivity syndrome, which, as an example, which means they have XY or male chromosomes, but their body is totally female, except for the internal organs.
So there's the physical aspect, and then there's also the mental aspect too.
Exactly. So that's sex. Gender is actually another system of classification that describes characteristics that we ascribe to bodies. And the word we use for gender is where we use sex, male and female. For gender, we use masculine and feminine. So there are masculine women and there are feminine men. And we tend to think culturally, again, because of our preconceived notions, that means that they must be gay or lesbian. So you see a man with feminine characteristics, so he must be a gay man. You see a woman with masculine characteristics, oh, she must be a lesbian. Not necessarily true. People have all kinds of combinations of characteristics and physical characteristics, psychological characteristics, gender characteristics, the gender presentation characteristics. And it's only been in the last roughly 70 years that we've been able to really hone in on gender from a scientific perspective and look at what is gender identity and how does that, from a psychological standpoint, impact or interact with our sexual orientation, our gender presentation, and how we feel about ourselves. So we are more complex organisms than plants, let's put it that way. And we have to start looking at the complexities and the intersectionalities that everybody has in their own person.
And of course, there's also people who don't identify as either masculine or feminine.
That's right.
Both.
Right. There are people who are starting to use the terminology non-binary. When I was young, the term was androgynous. So combining characteristics of both masculine and feminine. Non-binary can also mean more expansive and mean both combining or um, exceeding, surpassing, ignoring, all kinds of things like that. So there's a lot of both mental and physiological aspects to this, and there's nothing wrong with any of it. It's just part of humanity.
Right. And then I also wanted to highlight the fact that there's gender neutral pronouns too, right? For people who are non-binary and prefer those pronouns, identify with those pronouns. So I'd like to transition to the need for financial planning with the community. You've obviously been an activist and advocate for a really long time, decades. So would you agree that financial planning is potentially an even greater need for transgender people than for cisgender people?
Well, I think transgender people are very much like cisgender people in their need for financial planning. I don't think being a transgender person makes your need any greater, actually, because a cisgender person may have a financial goal or aspirations that are extremely important to them that they may need to take into account, how to manage that, how to save for it, how to plan for it, just as much as a transgender person has certain medical needs that they have to take care of. Cis people do too. I don't think it's any different. I really think trans people are just like any other human being. Their just needs might just be a little different.
And have you seen the community improve financially over years? Because I was actually reading some numbers from the Williams Institute, and they're saying that 29% of the community is below federal poverty level. And we focus on Black and Latinx trans people, it's 40 and 45% respectively.
Right. There's a lot of disparity, and that's probably because there's so much prejudice and bias against trans people in general. So when people are young, they are often pushed out of the house. Their educational opportunities are stopped. They, as a result, don't get coached in any way into any kind of meaningful occupation, and they struggle for the rest of their lives. So that happens whether you're a person of color or a white person. So that's one of the factors. But because of visibility of trans people over the last 50 years, people have seen that there are the people like them and they don't have to be so isolated. It's increased the ability of people to actually focus on all aspects of their life. And one of the main things that I've tried to do in my activism, and one of the things that motivated me over 30 years ago when I became active in this regard, was there are so many good people who happen to be trans, and they should not be full of shame and suffering. They should be able to just have their transition and move on. They don't have to be stuck in that space. And they need to, one of the reasons you want to transition is to actualize yourself, to really be the full person that you are, and to be the person that you already are, but other people don't see. And that's what helps people move forward in their lives, is to be able to just take care of that and move on.
And would you say that trans people are open to seeking services from a financial planner? Are they hesitant, would you say? What's your opinion?
Well, I think many trans people are afraid to approach professionals who they don't know for a fact have some kind of understanding that they're going to be able to talk openly with them about their goals, about their history, about inconsistencies that might exist in their past, that might exist in their documentation, or even in the stocks that they own might be in different names. It's just a lot of confusion. And if you don't feel confident in expressing that to a professional, that's very difficult to approach. At the same time, I think that there because we've heard so much about the disparities, we've heard so much about the oppression and the limitations that are placed on trans people, we don't imagine that there are elderly trans people or that there are trans people who are very, very wealthy. And believe me, there are both of those things. The woman who invented Sirius XM, Sirius satellite radio, is a trans woman. She now leads a major pharmaceutical company and is the highest paid female CEO in the United States. Yes, there's the woman who invented VLSI logic, and which is the foundation of programming that allows the internet to be what it is today, was a trans woman. And there's just a lot of very, very intelligent, very accomplished trans people out there. Some of the leading attorneys working in the field of civil rights are trans men. And we have some incredible advocates in that arena who are virtually invisible. So you think of trans people as either completely oppressed, or Laverne Cox, and famous and a wealthy actress. Well, you hope she's wealthy. She's certainly famous. But there's trans people are everywhere. They're in all occupations. They're in all races, classes, and cultures. And they have the same kind of needs that other people, non-trans people, have. Cisgender people, I should say, rather than non-transgender. It's a little more positive.
And within the trans community, I mean, would you say that some people have it easier than others? I mean, obviously money is a big factor, but I think also ethnicity, background is a big factor too, right? Yes,
absolutely. I mean, certainly there is such a thing as white privilege in this culture, and trans people can have it as well. There are obstacles everywhere. And there are advantages that people have in various contexts in their lives. So privilege is something that exists. It's not exclusive to any one kind of person, but in certain contexts, there are certain people who will have advantages. I was personally advantaged because my parents valued education. And even though I was an extremely androgynous person growing up and was clearly transgender my entire life, and I didn't stop looking like a trans person until after I transitioned. I was privileged to get a good education, and that enabled me to learn how to work with systems, how to have confidence in engaging people from different walks of life, many other factors that many trans people don't have access to.
And speaking of access to services, and you've played a huge role in expanding services, medical services, to the transgender community. Please talk about that and how you've worked with health insurance companies.
Well, I saw when I was transitioning in 1988, and I was an engineering group manager for Sun Microsystems at the time, and I had just started working with Sun, and so I just got my employee benefits documents, and I noticed right away that there was an exclusion for any kind of treatments having to do with transsexualism or sex reassignment. That was the language of the day. The word transgender was not in use at the time. And I thought, well, I don't have any power to change that as an individual. Who has power to change that? The corporation has power to change that. They are the customer. They are the person buying the policy. So how can I leverage that? And it took me a few years to figure out a way to do that. And one way was I had an opportunity at the city of San Francisco. Human Rights Commission there was looking at discrimination against transgender people and trying to figure out a way to deal with to provide the Human Rights Commission a mechanism for addressing discrimination that transgender people in the city were facing. And I helped them write the legislation for that. I helped organize a public hearing that documented transgender discrimination. And when we passed the legislation, a non-discrimination legislation in 1994, which went into effect in 95, we passed it in 94, and I turned to the Human Rights Commission people and said, guess what? Now you're in violation of your Equal Benefits Ordinance, which was the ordinance that took domestic partner benefits across the United States. San Francisco was the driver of making domestic partner benefits possible throughout the country. So they understood that language, and they said, what do you mean though? How do we, and I said, well, you've got exclusions in your insurance policy. You need to change that. So it took another 6 years to get them to address this in one of their 5 insurance policy options that they offered to employees of the city and county. And once they did that in the year 2000, and they made an inclusive plan an option for employees, then we took that to the Human Rights Campaign Foundation Workplace Project, which was starting the Corporate Equality Index. And the Corporate Equality Index is a measure for LGBT support for a corporation. What does the organization do that actively encourages LGBT success in the workplace? And benefits is a big part of that. And when they first started, they were trying to figure out how to include transgender people in the Corporate Equality Index. And so I was lucky enough to get in on the ground floor of that and to guide the Corporate Equality Index for the next, I guess, 12 a dozen years roughly. We started with just a requirement that a corporation had to have a non-discrimination ordinance and to include transgender people in their non-discrimination trainings, include the concepts of transgender in their non-discrimination trainings. But gradually we raised the bar and required them to offer specific positive benefits in their insurance plans. And through that, I worked with the Business Council and the Workplace Project staff at the Human Rights Campaign to develop lots and lots of trainings for employee benefits managers to be able to confront their carriers and make the demands. We finally got utilization data out of San Francisco because there was a public entity rather than a private business. And they had allocated over $5 million that they took out of premiums to apply to cover this benefit. And in the first 5 years or 6 years of the benefit's existence, they only paid out $156,000 in claims. When my contention has always been including transgender people in the healthcare coverage does not impact the bottom line. And once we prove that, many organizations have included transgender benefits at no additional cost.
Right, and because they're really not as expensive as people might think.
That's right. Yeah, people think that sex reassignment surgery is going to cost thousands and thousands of dollars. It's much less than an open heart surgery. It's more like an appendectomy in terms of price for the average procedure. Certainly there are some cases where there might be complications, but you think about what the insurance industry calls a bad pregnancy, which a complicated pregnancy with a difficult birth can often cost much more than a sex reassignment process.
Sure.
And that's over years too. It doesn't happen all at once.
Right. Although for some people who have a lot of money, it can happen pretty quickly.
Well, yes, when you have a lot of money, You don't have to go through all of the steps and get insurance coverage. If you have a lot of money, you can get whatever you want, whenever you want.
Even in the 70s.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And we actually got a question that I want to address from our audience, from Lindsay Young, who's a transgender woman financial advisor she just started her own financial advisory firm. She's really conflicted about how to be professionally. You know, while there are many out LGBT financial advisors, there are almost no out transgender financial advisors. So I have real concerns about coming out professionally myself. She says, my concerns are, one, if potential clients know about me being transgender, I fear very few people will choose to learn more about my services. Two, while I would love to serve other members of the transgender community, I don't want to limit myself to only servicing them. I also have more of a professional interest in serving business owners in addition to LGBT transgender people. So given where we are in a society, do you have any guidance for the few transgender advisors out there on how to present and market themselves professionally?
I think targeted marketing is important. And I think your personal status is not the crux of why you offer services. So it isn't what you advertise. It may be something you discuss with certain clients, but it doesn't have to be something you discuss with every client. How do gay and lesbian and bisexual financial planners approach this? I would ask your peers in the group, do you only advertise in the LGBT community? Do you only deal with LGBT clients? I think the same things would apply in the case of a transgender planner. And I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between pride and confidentiality. Your medical history is your medical history, and it's not germane in all cases to explain. You know, you might, if you had been a cancer survivor and you had a client who was dealing with cancer or had been a cancer survivor and had financial impacts of that, and now, you know, you might share that that's your situation too, and you understand what their concerns are, but you don't have to share it with everybody. How do you respond to that? I mean, what do you think, Robert?
Well, I was actually just going to comment. When I first started my practice, I went back into the closet. I went from being an activist in college and really involved in organizations to being afraid to being myself in this industry. And for 3 years, I was in the closet until I met someone and then decided it didn't matter anymore. But really, I was able to focus that's when I started to focus my practice on LGBT people. And just because I focus my practice on that, it doesn't certainly preclude me from working with anyone else. And in fact, people who are cisgender or are not part of the community appreciate that and want to see that you're serving this community that is so underserved. So I would say, you know, you don't necessarily have to limit yourself to this community. In fact, think about it as broadening your horizons, because you don't want to work with someone who doesn't support you anyway, right? That's the way I look at it. I know it's tough in the beginning, but ultimately you want to try to follow that. Now, James, you've done a lot of work with health insurance, and as financial planners, we do our best to help our clients insure themselves and understand their benefits at their employer, and also Medicare, which you've had a huge impact on. So can you please speak about how Medicare has expanded their services, their benefits as well to the community?
Well, I think, thanks for that question. I think really the benefit of going through the Corporate Equality Index and getting a lot of major Fortune 500 corporations and smaller organizations as well to enhance their benefit offerings and to prove that this doesn't break the bank is one of the reasons that Medicare lifted their restriction in 2014. Many people had tried to get Medicare to cover these procedures for for many, many years, but to no avail because of bad information that Medicare had taken in back in 1979, 1980, that they basically were completely biased against it and hadn't looked at the policies since then. And now that there was medical evidence that treatment is effective and that it actually does help people, and now that there was evidence that companies were able to provide these benefits without going down the financial tubes, they lifted their restriction, but they did not impose a national coverage guideline. They left it up to regional groups to decide whether or how benefits would be applied in specific individual cases by region. So there's no national coverage determination. However, once Medicare did this, many state Medicaid programs where non-discrimination policies had been put in place following the San Francisco model that had expanded to the state of California and then to Oregon and Washington, for example, and also Massachusetts and New York, and very many states have non-discrimination policies in place. These state Medicaid plans, people who are providing services were realizing that there's an awful lot of people in the Medicaid system who don't have access to health care because of these restrictions. And a lot of people got behind trying to move this forward at the different state levels and have been very successful. So the Medicare effort was seminal in that way. They actually opened the door for a lot more state programs that are very, very constructive for people who are less financially advantaged.
And how comprehensive is this care? How easy do they make it to qualify? What should we know as planners?
It varies by state. You really need to get to know your state's requirements, and the guideline that's most frequently referred to is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health Standards of Care, which right now is in its 7th edition. And that is usually the medical guideline that's followed. And but how that's implemented sometimes depends on, in a given state, depends on the dominant insurance or co-insurance companies that they use to deliver services, and also what their attitudes are. So there still may be opportunities for education within those arenas to try to improve things. But it varies by state because insurance is not a national instrument. It's state controlled.
I wanted to bring up another question that was brought up by the audience from Frank Summers. He says he knows of a financial advisor who has a large practice that was built before he transitioned. He only lost one client. And he wonders what Jamison, what you're seeing for discrimination in elder care assisted living. To him, that seems one reason to have funds or products that allow people more control to have services in their homes by people they choose.
That's absolutely right. And that's a great point, Frank. Thank you. I know who Frank is. Yes, long-term care issues are really, really important. Every bit as important as for gay and lesbian people who are often very timid about turning themselves over to institutions. Trans people are terrified about what might happen to them if they're compromised physically or intellectually, in particular, in a long-term care setting. We know that there's a lot of discrimination and antagonistic treatment of people from minority groups like LGBT people within those settings. And that's something that I think if there were ways that people could have more independence and more control over who they could choose to help take care of them and where that care could be provided, it would be really, really helpful for a lot of people to sort of decentralize those kinds of services. And it would, from the financial planning industry, it would be really interesting to have leverage exerted from a group such as yours, because you certainly have experience and expertise that I think would be really well received in the institutional settings or legislative settings where these things are often decided.
Sure. And how would you say that the Supreme Court's recent ruling on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act would affect things like that, discrimination and homes or just by services in general?
Well, I think that's a crucial, very important stepping stone toward greater comprehensive equality. The inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity as covered under sex discrimination in Title VII, that will increase leverage to include it in all other areas of discrimination where sex is a factor. And that there's going to need to be some help along the way, because people are going to resist, as people are already resisting the Title VII declaration. But it's a tremendous opportunity to provide more education about these factors and to really open up the humanity of everybody and have real equality and move forward. We still need the Equality Act to be passed. Title VII is not going to do it. Just amending that aspect of civil rights is not enough. We need issues taken care of in housing, public accommodations, education, all across the board.
Right, and credit as well. Something
yes, exactly.
Understanding.
Right.
And in terms of the Equality Act, how soon or how likely is what's happening with that right now?
Well, it's kind of on a back burner right now. We have a pandemic going on, but it's not something that people are neglecting. Certainly within the halls of Congress, the champions are still talking about it, but it's not the highest priority we have. I think as we achieve some kind of medical advance and a little bit better control of the virus that's going on, that we can then return to examining some of the factors that have been exposed by this virus, the factors of inequality, the factors of discrimination that have institutionalized discrimination that have plagued our country for such a long time. And I think that will elevate the Equality Act, and as people realize how important it really is to our health as well as everything else.
Not to mention we have a pretty unsupportive administration.
Right. We have to wait that out. There's got to be a transition away from this current administration, which has no social conscience whatsoever. So I really hope that we'll make some progress this fall.
Yeah. One of our audience members, Diana, would like to know where we can learn more about the Equality Act.
You can learn more about it. The Human Rights Campaign Human Rights Campaign, hrc.org, will have information about it on their website. You could ask your congressperson about it directly, and see what they send you. And because they are considering it. So they should have copies of the actual act. You can find those online. And, but most of the advocacy organizations that deal with civil rights will also have information about it. Southern Poverty Law Center, even Lambda Legal is one that should have good information about it. There's many avenues.
Great, thank you. And I want to reference something that you talk about in your book that you co-authored last year, Navigating Trans and Complex Gender Identities, which, by the way, for those of us today that don't fully comprehend transgender communities or what goes through their minds and their needs and how we can better serve them, this book is a great resource for that in understanding the complexities of the community and really just how to address transgender needs. But in that book, you talk about how we can change awareness and how activism is the work of changing awareness that is constantly taking place in a wide variety of contexts. And as financial planners, I strongly believe that we have to be fully aware of all communities that we potentially serve and how they're changing and how we can better support them. So what can we as financial planners do to manifest allyship, not just within our individual practices, but in the industry as a whole?
Well, I think one main thing really is to include the terminology, transgender and non-binary, those words in particular, in your messaging as an industry. That is a signal that there's some consciousness there and that people don't have to be quite so on edge in approaching the industry. So that's probably the easiest thing, but underlying that, each person needs to educate themselves about what this community is, who these people are, who we are, what do we need. And I think an important practice that you can develop as an individual is to speak up when others debase or deride trans or non-binary people, and start role modeling respectful and inclusive language. And I think there's just, it's a lot about education, and it's a gradual process. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think there's a lot that is simple to do. Of course, I recommend reading books that I've written, which the Becoming a Visible Man focuses a lot on the trans-masculine perspective, which is seriously ignored in even within the transgender movement. Most of the focus is on people who transition from male to female or have trans feminine expression, because those are the people who are most obvious and most of an affront to the existing power structures. And I discuss a lot of that. I discuss that in Becoming a Visible Man as well. But navigating trans and complex gender identities is a very, very good tool. It's actually intended for an education market. So it's an education textbook to be used in colleges and universities. So it's written in a very clear way, not like super academic. And I think that you could get a lot out of it. So, but when in the business context, when trans and non-binary people are not part of a decision-making process, and you think that they're going to be impacted by this, try to identify the gap and advocate as best you can, including being willing to say, I don't know how to answer this question. Let's find out more. Let's get some trans and non-binary people involved in this process to help us make this decision, or to help us envision this program, or whatever it is you're working on. I think, see, some of the other things that politely correct other people if they use the wrong pronouns. Make a sincere effort to use pronouns that people express that that's the pronoun that they identify with. Ask respectfully what pronoun do you want me to use if it's not clear to you. And then work hard to try to disengage the reptilian brain where we store people's pronoun information and acknowledge people for who they are. It's like, imagine, if you think of a woman gets married and changes her name, and men can do this too now, but it used to be just women who would change their name when they got married. We have no problem at all accepting their new name. We ought very quickly, maybe a few little mix-ups, but we just adapt. With trans people, people actively resist changing that, and then they are so hung up on the fact that it's changed that they get caught in their brain and always make a mistake when they refer to that person, either their name or their pronoun. And those are real problems. When trans people feel that as a microaggression, and you get enough of those microaggressions, and you can explode. And it's a really, really damaging thing ultimately. Most trans people are totally willing to forgive people making sincere mistakes. And if you do make a mistake, just acknowledge and move on. Don't make a big deal about it. Don't apologize all over yourself. And, that's just even more embarrassing for a trans person. So just try to be conscious of the individual in front of you, who they are, what their goals are, how you can help them achieve those, and acknowledging their name and their pronoun, even if their documents might not line up, even if they haven't done all of their name change documents or something. Take the name that they want you to use and use it.
Yeah. And
So,
I think a real simple way is just to include your pronoun, your own pronoun in your signature. For example, you're emailing someone and they see that you acknowledge the existence of different pronouns and how you choose to identify yourself. So that's a really easy way for everyone.
yes, it is. Thanks for bringing that up. That's good.
Yeah. And you brought up another point, that mentioning or admitting that you don't know. And I think that's a question that all financial planners need to be comfortable with, and when we don't know something, right? And I think we have another question here from Frank again. Are there sensitive ways to talk to people about their history or their dead name, especially if they still have financial holdings in that dead name, or if we need to understand their history or for life insurance purposes? Any landmines to be sure we don't step on?
Well, you never know how a person is going to react to that kind of thing. Most people who are going to bring everything in and talk to you about it are probably going to be able to acknowledge that, yes, they have documents or instruments that are in another name. They don't have control over how they were named in a will, for example. It's not their will, so what can they do about it? And you need to be prepared to help them understand how to approach that, or to, if you sense that there's immense distress, you might want to know about some, helpful mental health counselors in your area who can help them work through that process and hold less shame. So that's something to think about, maybe. But it's very important not to ask about people's medical history or their bodies, but to acknowledge that you understand that people have a lot of kinds of differences, and you're concerned about everybody's human rights and abilities to plan for their future. And so you want to just be as open as possible to taking in the information that they have, even if it's contradictory, even if it's surprising, even if it's embarrassing. Try not to be embarrassed about it yourself. Try to be practical and matter of fact, but don't dismiss it either, because it's a real painful potential thing that they're dealing with, and they will need to know you're on their side.
Great, thank you for that. And by the way, I did include the both titles of the books that we've referenced today in the group chat, if you'd like to go and look those up. One of our other Pride planners, Joey, has just put a link to make sure you connect with us and join our page on the Connect page, and he's included the link for that so that you can engage in conversations with other planners with this same outlook. But I want to open it up to see if anyone else has any more questions to ask James about the transgender community or anything that we've discussed today. Looks like we're just about wrapping up then. The last thing I want to go over, James, is what do planners need to know about the process of transitioning in terms of, let's say we have a client who decides to transition. How should we be prepared for that?
Well, in terms of, they need to take into account what kind of costs they're going to have. They need to review their benefits if they have employee benefits that they can access, or their Medicare situation, or and then just be ready to see, I don't know how many times you're going to meet with them in a year, but they're going to change. Their appearance is going to change, and they're going to experience puberty, regardless of how old they are. They're going to go through puberty again if they're taking a hormonal administration to transition their body from male to female or female to male. Either way, they're going to go through puberty no matter how old they are. So they're going to have some emotional shifts that go on, and some people have better control over that than others, and some people manage it better than others. It can be a challenge sometimes because you are, how you are in puberty, you're unsure of your social space, you're unsure of how you're going to navigate various situations. So when you get into a place where you feel safe, and that might be your planner's office if you have a good relationship, you might express some things that you wouldn't express other places. And so be ready for that, and just, be accepting and, constructive wherever you can be, and be gentle, because they're a teenager in one way or another. They're a teenager still. And usually people who have good, solid maturity already will get through that period faster than others. Biochemically, it takes 5 to 7 years to do that, but many people get through it in 2 to 3 years.
Okay, so the physical aspect can be quick, a couple of years, right?
Depending on when you can schedule and afford the surgeries, yeah.
But for everyone, including Caitlyn Jenner, who did it very quickly, needs 5 to 7 years.
Biochemically, that's the way the body works. Yep.
Great. Well, thank you very much, James, for joining us today. We feel very lucky to have you speak to us and
thank you,
and share your knowledge. This should be available on our website afterwards for viewing. And you can always contact us if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And we hope to see you next month at our Pride Planner Circle.
Thanks very much, Robert. And thank you, everyone, for your attention. I appreciate it.